Hashtag worst parent ever. Let me just give you the premise behind it quickly. You remember when you were a kid and your parents told you you had to do something or you couldn't do something that you really wanted, and you looked at them and you either said it out loud or you said it in your head, you're the worst parent ever, right? But then you got a little older and you started looking back and you're like, maybe they actually knew something. Right? And so the whole premise of this series is to encourage you as a parent, because right now in the process of parenting, we're called upon to make some tough decisions. We're called upon to ask our kids or tell our kids or teach our kids to do something that right now they may look at us and say under their breath, or if they have the audacity to say it out loud, you're the worst parent ever. All right? And sometimes it just kind of in our hearts feel like this is not any fun, and we just want to step back. And I just want to encourage you throughout this series to just to embrace the fact that sometimes along the way you might hear that, but I want to help you to give you a high five and encourage and affirm and say, keep doing some of these things that you're doing, because at the end of the day, when they're an adult, they're going to turn around and give you a high five and say, thank you for making me do those things that when I was a kid I didn't want to do. You remember those moments? And that's what this whole series is about. So I encourage you to be a part of that. And even if you don't have kids, this is going to be one of those series that when we're talking, you're going to be like, yeah, if I have kids, when I have kids, that's what I want. And then it'll also help you to, when you're sitting in a restaurant and that family's sitting next to you, you'd be like, oh, yeah, you should give them this, right? Okay, So here's the scoop. On Sundays like today, this is the holiday weekend, and typically what we do is we teach through series. And so we'll take a topic, and we'll talk about it for 4 or 5 different weeks, and we'll say about everything we can say on that particular topic, and then we'll pick another topic, and we'll talk on that for a while. And so you get days like today, which are a holiday season, and so it's kind of like in between teaching series, and so we call these standalone lessons, or standalone sermons, or standalone whatever. And I actually had something I was going to talk about this weekend, and something else jumped onto my radar this week, and it was so impactful for me. I'm like, I got to change everything I was going to talk about this weekend, and I got to tell you this thing that's resonating right now really big in my heart. But first of all, let me just step back. Sometimes, as a preacher, I take for granted that. I guess sometimes I don't share with you how we come up with sermons. So it's not like we're following a book from the Pope. He doesn't tell us what to preach. The bishops don't tell. So sometimes it might be interesting for you to know, like, how do you guys decide what to teach? And I thought I'd just kind of bring you in, like open the curtain and let you see behind the scenes a little bit. So oftentimes we'll figure out what to teach by what God is doing in my life. So a lot of times, like if something's happening in my life and it's burning bright on my radar, and I feel like it's something that should be shared with the church, I'll teach from that. Not always, because not everything that God is doing in my life it would be helpful for you. But sometimes God will be doing something in my life, and I'll feel like this is something that the church might actually benefit from. So let's have this conversation. And then there's times that I'll hear from you guys. You'll have questions, or I'll hear things that you say, or I'll see stuff on Facebook. I do actually read your Facebook sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, and don't be freaked out about that because God sees it too. But sometimes I'll hear questions from you, and I'm like, that's something that we should talk about. In fact, just this summer, we talked through the whole book of Galatians. We did this series on connect. How do we connect to God? And that came out of conversations that I've been a part of and questions that I've heard you ask. And so that's how we got to that series. And then sometimes there are just foundational topics. We're always going to talk about faith. We're always going to talk about family. That's why we're doing this hashtag worst parent ever. We're always, from time to time, we're going to talk about finances because it's such a big deal in our life. So we'll have that conversation on a fairly regular basis. Sometimes we look around at culture, what's happening in cultures. The church should address it. Other times I'll reading through the Bible and a verse will jump out. It's like, this is something we have to talk about at church, or a book that I might read, or I might be watching a movie and a theme or an idea pops out. And typically what happens in any of these things, when these ideas come in, like, this is something that we should have a conversation at church about, what I'll do then is then we'll go to the Bible and say, okay, what does God say about this idea? And so, interestingly enough, this week I was watching a video on YouTube. Anyone ever watch YouTube? Right, everybody watches YouTube, pretty much, all right? And there was a guy named Julian Pineau, and he is what's called a mobility specialist. And He works with athletes, and he works with largely athletes, and just teaching them how to do how to have right form, and how to be completely mobile, and how to move your shoulders, and how to move your hips and your knees. And he teaches. That sounds like a lot of fun, doesn't it? Hello? Okay, so I'm watching this guy, and he used a phrase that really stuck out to me. This is a phrase that he used right here. He talked about the key log. And then he talked about how, as a young man, he had seen a documentary on National Geographic, and it was all about the logging industry. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Like, that does not appeal to me in any way, the logging industry. I'm not a logger. I've chopped down a tree or two with a hatchet when I was a kid to build a fort, but as a matter of practice, I don't log, all right? I don't chop trees down, don't need a chainsaw, although I think I should, right? Because you never know when you need a chainsaw. Can I get a witness, fellas? Like, you just might need a chainsaw someday, and you don't want to have to go try to find one. So, nevertheless, I've not done a tremendous amount of logging in my life. But as I listened to him talk about this documentary he had seen as a kid, I was actually pretty interested in it. In fact, I was so interested that I spent a good number of hours this week reading about logging and watching various parts of documentaries about logging. And so, if this whole preaching gig doesn't work out, I might actually... I'm kidding. So let me tell you what I learned about loggers. Loggers used to cut down trees, and they would take them to the river, and they would actually float them down the river to the mill. And at the mill, they would pull them out, and they would cut them up, and they would plane them, and then they would ship them out to various parts of the country where they would be used to build businesses, to build houses, to build churches, to build, various... Honestly, if you think about it, like, the economy was built in large part around wood. So, like, this idea of logging, that was a really big driver in the economy. And what would happen is fairly often in this process from the time they'd chop down these trees and they'd get them down to the river and they'd drop them in the river and the river would take them down to the mill, fairly often in this process, something called a log jam would happen, right? You've probably heard of log jams. All these trees, all these big chunks of wood floating down the river, and sometimes they hit a small spot in the river and they get all jammed up. That's kind of crazy. And so what I want to do is I want to show you a picture, and then I want to read to you just a little bit from Wikipedia about this process, all right? These are log drivers. There's an actual picture of some old guys. See, we don't do this anymore. We don't float them down the river nearly as much as what we used to. These are guys who would actually, they would be a part of the process. They would run back and forth on the logs as they were floating down the river and make sure they're all heading the same way and they weren't getting sideways and getting stuck. So let me read to you this. To ensure that logs drifted freely along the river, men called log drivers, or river pigs, I'm pretty sure they would prefer log drivers, were needed to guide the logs. That's what these guys were. The drivers typically divided into two groups. The more experienced and nimble men comprised the jam crew, or the beat crew. That almost sounds like something you do, Mikey D, right? All right. They watched the spots where logs were likely to jam, and when a jam started, they tried to get to it quickly and dislodge the key logs before many logs stacked up. In other words, they see all these logs are floating down, and they hit a narrow spot, and one might start to get in this way and block the flow of the other logs. So these guys would run up, and they'd unlodge that log so that everything could keep flowing in the same direction. If they didn't do this, the river would keep piling on more logs, forming a partial dam which could raise the water level. Millions of board feet of lumber could back up for miles upriver, requiring weeks to break up, with some lumber possibly lost if it was shoved far enough into the shallows. So when the jam crew saw a jam start, they rushed to it and tried to break it up using PVs and possibly even dynamite. This job required some understanding of physics, strong muscles, and extreme agility. The jam crew was an exceedingly dangerous occupation, with the drivers standing on the moving logs and running from one to the other. Many drivers lost their lives by falling and being crushed by the logs. So this idea of a key log, this idea, when I heard this guy talk about a key log, I'm like, it's an amazing concept here. So I've done a little bit of research. This is what a key log is, right? The log, which if removed, would free up the whole log jam. So the key issue or problem, which if solved or resolved, would make the current task easy to complete. In other words, everything's flowing along just fine. All of a sudden, burp, this one thing gets in the way and it messes everything up. That's your key log. You get rid of that key log, you straighten that up, and everything resumes normally. Now, again, I'm not a logger, and I've never been a logger. So when I was reaching or watching videos and reading about this stuff, I was absolutely blown away. And I thought, I really want you to see some of what I saw. So I found a 2-minute clip, and I'm going to tell you, first of all, I've already been mocked mercilessly by some of our pastors and some of the worship team because they saw it this morning. And all I would ask is be kind, and when you see this video, and it's from a documentary called Timber on the Move, A History of Log Moving Technology. It's going to look like a video that you saw when you were in elementary school, okay? So I just want to tell you right up front. But just watch this, and this is an amazing thing to me, and I hope I'm not overselling it, because I was super excited when I saw it. So here we go. We're going to watch it, all right? This is the process of moving logs down the stream. Now watch this. Here we go. You ready?
Splash dams were built to back up water on smaller streams. And with the spring thaw, the dramatic river drive began. Sluice gates were opened to flood the stream beds, and thousands of pulpwood logs started the long trip downstream. Log drivers worked 15-hour days to get the logs moving and to keep them on their way. 12-foot pike poles of black spruce or ash with screw tips were used to pull and prod the bulky logs. Sometimes dynamite charges were placed under key logs to break up snags and jams. Splash dams could be refilled and opened several times during the spring driving season to flush the accumulated logs downstream. Much advance work had been done on the stream beds to facilitate the drive. Obstructing boulders had been blasted, snags removed, and low banks blocked off. In spite of this effort, waters often spilled over and flooded adjacent farmlands. Suits resulting from this type of damage contributed to the eventual demise of the colorful river drive. Generally, logging was done along several tributaries of a larger stream, and the floating logs converged to form a massive flow. Sometimes, logs ran into a lake, as shown here, before continuing downriver. Strings of long logs, called booms, were stretched across inlets to collect the floating logs. Pulled tight around pockets of pulpwood, the booms were then towed by tugboat across the lake. This lake had been backed up by a dam, and the logs are stored here for controlled release. These men are guiding the logs through a sluiceway leading downstream. Here, the drivers take to boats to keep the logs moving. The flat-bottom bateaux required skillful coordination by the oarsmen to retain control in swift waters. Lines are fastened to the boats to hold them in place in the rapids while the drivers do their work. The distance logs might travel to reach a mill varied, but in the Northeast, drives of 75 to 100 miles were common.
That's amazing. Like, was that good? Yeah, okay. So all y'all who mocked me, you know, right? I mean, that's incredible. I saw all those logs going. That's crazy. And so, you know, I'm watching this and I'm thinking about all this. And as I see this picture in particular, I'm like, let's just be honest. Are there moments in which this picture reminds you of your life? I mean, just all kinds of craziness, but it's kind of working. I mean, it's all going in the same direction, and it's really crazy, but it is kind of working. And you know, as I watch them, I'm thinking, you know, there's lots of activity in hopes of producing income and value. And I thought, you know, really, that's what we do with our lives, right? There's all kinds of activity, and we're trying to produce income. We're trying to produce lives that have value to them. Really, that's what it's all about, right? We go to work, we work really hard, we make time to play, we make some time to love, we try to sneak in a little time for ourselves, try to work God into the big picture there. And honestly, there are lots of times where it feels kind of like controlled chaos. Our lives kind of feel like a bunch of logs rushing in the same direction. And then there are times when it just like something happens. And we're not always sure what caused it, but what we know now is that it feels like there's a log jam. Like that controlled chaos has just turned into wide open, uncontrolled chaos, pending disaster. Now, by the way, back in the days when a log jam would happen like that, it could potentially ruin local economies. I mean, so like the log jam would happen, the water would start backing up, it would flood fields, it could ruin local riverside towns, it would ruin the lumber, which could be a potential cost of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to the lumber industry. It could potentially end up in lost jobs. So a log jam was a terrible thing. So, this kind of looks like, go back, and feels like life sometimes. Everything's busy and chaotic, but it is kind of working. And then it seems like something, we're not always sure exactly what, but something happens which creates this logjam effect in our life. And all of a sudden, things that were flowing kind of smoothly aren't working so good anymore. Maybe things begin to get jacked up financially, or the relationship with your spouse, or your relationship with your kids, or things are off at work and you're having to stay over there, which throws your schedule off at home. And maybe you're just too tired to get into the gym, or it feels like getting up for church. That's not a good idea. Staying in bed is a better idea. And just everything is crazy, logjam. And sometimes we have a tendency to think to ourselves this question here: why is everything going wrong? It just seems like everything, like finances, relationships, spiritually, physically, it just feels like there's a lot. Am I talking to myself, or do you guys with me on that? Okay, I mean, it feels like sometimes we have a sentence that goes like this: when it rains, it... Right. It's not just one thing, it's everything. It feels like a logjam. And so the question we ask ourselves is, why is everything going wrong? But what I'm beginning is, as I've been processing this idea this week, I'm thinking maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe instead of asking that question, maybe we should start asking this question: what is the key log here? What is the problem that's causing the problems? Maybe it's not everything. Maybe it's one thing or two things that we've really kind of let slide. We've really kind of not paid enough attention to. And it's those one or two things that are backing up everything. Does that make sense? So what I wanted to do is I wanted to process some thoughts that I'm having about this with you today. Some thoughts about key logs, how to identify them and what to do about them. And we'll go from there. All right? So here's the first thought about key logs I'm processing. It may take some time to find the key log. So if you're at this place right now where it seems like everything's been busy, it's been crazy, but it's all kind of been working together, but for some reason this week or last month or whatever the case is, something has happened which has just resulted in all kinds of chaos and everything is not working like it used to, maybe there's a key log. And what I want to say to you is, I think it's worth trying to find the key log, but it might take some time. It might actually take more time than what you anticipate. See, here's what we learned about key logs, right? When there was a log jam, they would send a team out to find it. And remember what we read about this team? This is what we heard from history. This job required some understanding of physics, strong muscles, and extreme agility. I mean, this identifying the key log and addressing the key log was not something done by a bunch of guys smoking pipes sitting on the bank. This required hands-on, close-up investigation. I mean, they had to get in. They were moving around. They were probing. They were shifting logs, and they were working until they actually identified the key log. And in most instances, this was not something that happened immediately. So the thing we need to, the first observation is simply this: it may take time to find this key log in our life. Now, as I'm processing this, I'm realizing that most of us really, we want that problem fixed just about as, we want it to take about as long as it would take for us to get a milkshake at Chick-fil-A. We want to be able to identify, fix, and get back to normal just quick. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, right? And so what I've found is that is also unfortunate is that a lot of us, when we don't find the problem right away, we quit looking. And that has potential to be incredibly destructive. And I've seen it and you've seen it. I mean, it might be like this: marriages that have experienced a log jam, Like it was going well, and then all of a sudden something happened, or you may not even be sure what happened, and next thing you know, it just feels like everything is going wrong in your marriage, and you might read a book together, or you might go on a date and try to figure some things out, or you might go to a seminar, or you might talk to your friends, and you might work on a little bit, but it doesn't get better immediately, so you just kind of quit. And now there's a logjam in your marriage. I've seen this in financial peace, or in the shape-up class that we offer here at our church, in which people learn about how to get their bodies in shape so they can honor God with their bodies, right? We'll start off, we get fired up, we'll get some information. We walk into the class like, man, I'm broke, or man, I'm not well physically. I need to make some changes. And we get in there, and all of a sudden we begin to hear Dave Ramsey talk or Rob Polenick talk, and all of a sudden we realize this is going to take a long time, and we try, and we don't see the results immediately, and we get discouraged, and we just kind of be like, oh, it happens spiritually. See, finding this key log, it actually might take a considerable amount of time. But if you don't take that time to identify that key log and unlodge it, the results will be disastrous. However, if you do take the time, you know this, if you do take the time to find the problem that's causing the problems, the potential there is great. And so I would just say to you, first of all, as you're going through life and you find that you've experienced some form of a log jam, like just things aren't working, could I just encourage you to take the time? It's going to take some time, but to go ahead and invest the time to find the key log and unlodge it. The second thought about key logs is this. It will take outside help, and it may be painful to unlodge this key log. Now, when there was a log jam, as I was reading all this stuff and I was watching these documentaries, and when there was a log jam, they would bring in a jam crew. This was a group of men who identified and unjammed jams, right? And I'm telling you that there are some jams in your life, some jams in my life that can't be unjammed by ourselves. Isn't that right? See, here's the thing. The way you think and the way you act and the way I think and the way I act is what got us where we are. Albert Einstein said we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. We're going to need help from the outside. Now, a jam team, someone who comes in and actually helps with the process of getting unstuck, might be a professional, or it might be a friend. It might be a group of friends who are all willing to speak truth into your life. Now, it's interesting, when the jam team would find the jam, they would take sharp poles and they would poke and they would prod, and sometimes they would actually take dynamite and drop it down in there and run like crazy and blow the whole thing up. But ultimately, it was that kind of hard work, that kind of painful process that unblocked the whole log jam. And I just want to tell you, when you sit down with your jam team, it can feel like you're being poked with a sharp stick, or it can feel like there's some dynamite going off when they begin to identify the log jams, the key logs in your life. But look at this. This is from Solomon in the book of Proverbs. He says, if you listen to constructive criticism, you'll be at home among the wise. So let's stop for a second. Listen, the first thing in this process is saying, man, something is not going right because everything is going wrong. There must be a key log here. There must be a problem that's causing all the problems. And so you begin to work and you begin to think and you begin to try to figure out what that is. And you realize, man, I'm going to need help from the outside. So you bring some friends in, or a friend in, or maybe you go to a professional and ask them for your help. And what you realize is they begin to speak to you and they begin to talk to you and they begin to point things out. You might get a little defensive. You might get a little embarrassed. It might be a little awkward. It might hurt to hear some of the things that are said. But Solomon says, listen, if you'll listen to constructive criticism, you'll be a home among the wise. In other words, the log jam will break up. And then he says this: if you reject discipline, you only harm yourself. In other words, the log jam remains, and lots of value will be lost. But if you listen to correction, you will grow in understanding. I just want to tell you some of the best and simultaneously most painful conversations have been when I've been sitting across the table from a friend who's spoken hard truth into my life. But as I've sat and received that hard truth, you know what I've found? As I acted on the things that they said, the logjam broke free and my life began to change. So I would just say to you, listen, if you're willing and you sit down and you'll listen and receive the input of a friend or friends, not argue, not make excuses, not be defensive, it's very likely that you'll actually find the logjam breaking up in your life. Again, Solomon said, I love what he said. Look at this. He said, wounds from a sincere friend are better than many kisses from an enemy. Is that good? I mean, I like this because here's the truth. A lot of us would prefer to be kissed and loved on, pampered, high-fived, affirmed. Solomon said something even better than that is to have a friend who loves you enough to sit down across the table from you, look you in the eye and say, there's a problem here. There's an attitude. There's a spending problem. There's an addiction. There's a series of habits. I see how you interact with your wife. I see the fact that you're not carrying through on the things that you said. I mean, a friend who will sit across the table from you and speak hard words. Solomon said, those wounds are more valuable than the insincere praise of a friend. Now, I actually pray that you're fortunate enough to have a friend in your life who will speak words like that. And let me just say, if you don't have a friend in your life, I know a really great place to start finding some friends. Anybody else know? Life groups. You guys, absolutely. I mean, this is what, stop for just a minute. This is what the church does. This is the job of the church, is to create an environment where people can find friends who help one another. Is to become a part of a group of people where you know me and I know you, and you can speak into my life and I can speak into your life. Listen, if you don't have friends who are willing to say that kind of thing to you, who are willing to speak difficult truths to you, you're not going to get better, and you may actually end up missing a lot of the good things that God has in store for you because you have a key log that no one has the courage or the insight to address. I pray to God that you will make yourself available to be perhaps on a jam crew of someone's life. And I pray that you'll make yourself available to people who will be on your jam crew. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to make a better life, is someone who has friends who are willing to step up. Solomon said it like this in Proverbs 27:17. He said, as iron sharpens iron, so a friend sharpens a friend. As iron sharpens iron, when iron, it's not always pretty. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes there's dust, but at the end of the day, it's a sharper sword. My prayer is that as you are evolving in your faith and in your life, that you are surrounding yourself with people who will be a jam team for you, who will break up the log jams by identifying the key logs that are holding you back. Now, a third thought about key logs is this. You are either feeding or fixing the problem. Now, when a log jam happens, hey, aren't you glad, logging, everybody's going to go home and be like, I want to be a logger. I want to watch log jam documentaries today, right? Now, when a log jam happens, it's either going to get better because somebody fixes it, somebody identifies the key log and breaks it up, so it's going to get fixed, or it's going to get worse, depending on what actions are taken or not taken. So this summer, I actually read something that has stuck with me, and it's lingered, and I'm processing this as well. I read about the relationship between attention and anxiety. And so it goes kind of like this. Have you ever noticed that the more you pay attention to something, the more it hurts? The more aware of it you are? And so often, in an effort to feel less, we just ignore, right? Like I've heard it said like this, your kids are playing on the ball field and somebody gets hurt, and one of the best lines I've heard anywhere is, hey, just slap some dirt on it, you'll be okay, right? Like, don't pay attention to it, just get up, come on, work through that pain, you got it, all right? In other words, don't pay attention to it, because if you focus on it, it hurts. We do this with our kids all the time, right? They have a little boo-boo, and it's not a big boo-boo. You're a parent, you're a smart adult, you can see that's not a big boo-boo. It's just a tiny little thing, but they're staring at it and crying and screaming and yelling, and so you try to distract them, right? Okay. The formula goes like this. Attention equals increased anxiety. Ignore equals decreased anxiety. In In other words, the more I think about it, the more I focus on it, the more I stare at this little boo-boo on my arm, the more it hurts. And so what I've found over time is, as a defense mechanism, if I ignore it, it doesn't bother me as bad. That's a great defense mechanism sometimes, but it's not always a good defense mechanism because sometimes we ignore important stuff. Let me give you a couple of historical examples. In this book, Vital Lies, Simple Truths, it's called The Psychology of Self-Deception. This is where I read about this concept. They gave a couple of military examples where people ignored something that was absolutely critical, but they ignored it. And as a result, history was changed. Let me just read to you. In the First World War, a week before the Germans launched their first attack with a poison gas, a German deserter brought a warning that such an attack would occur. He even brought along one of the masks that the German troops had been issued to protect them. The French commander who received this message dismissed it as absurd and rebuked his messenger for not having gone through proper channels. Here's the thing. If that French commander would have laid in bed at night and thought about it and processed it, can you imagine what his anxiety level would have been? Instead, what did he do? He ignored it, said, "You're absolutely out of your mind, you're crazy," decreased anxiety, and as such, the Germans were able to launch a preemptive strike. Another illustration, World War II. One of the German generals was told that an Allied fighter had been shot down over a German city, the first that had ever been seen far behind the Axis lines. This meant the Allies had developed a long-range fighter that could escort bombers over Germany. Göring, who was a pilot himself, this German general, said, "There's no way that's possible." His reply was this: "I officially assert that American fighter planes did not reach this city, and I give you an official order that they were not there." Ignore the problem. Well, it turned out it was a pretty significant problem for the Germans, if you're aware of World War II history. In the same war, last illustration. On the day the Germans began their offensive against Russia, a Soviet frontline unit sent the message to headquarters: "We are being fired on. What will we do?" Headquarters responded, "You must be insane," because no German force had ever been that far into Russia. You're not being fired on. In other words, rather than face the reality, we have a problem here, they ignored it, which decreased anxiety. Let me give you two more illustrations. Life insurance. Do you realize how many people don't have adequate life insurance? Why? Because when we actually think about life insurance, it causes us anxiety, because when you think about life insurance, you're thinking about your own death or someone's death. So rather than think about it, we tend to ignore it, and consequently, lots and lots of people, let's say it that way, are underinsured. Because anxiety often follows attention. Now, I say all that to say, oftentimes in an effort to decrease our own personal anxiety and in an effort to decrease our own personal emotional pain, many of us choose to ignore the problem that's causing problems. And I want to say that's a guaranteed destruction process. You're feeding the problem by ignoring it. You're allowing it to grow by ignoring it. And it will ultimately win. It will ultimately consume you. It will ultimately destroy you. Just because you ignore it, just because you are not paying attention to it, does not mean it's not growing and expanding and becoming bigger in your life. So I would simply say this: please, if life has been cruising along for you at a fairly good pace, it's been kind of crazy, but now all of a sudden it just seems like everything's going wrong, would you please take the time to begin to ask questions, to begin to fix the problem rather than feeding that problem, because it will consume you. So let me do this real quick. Let me give you 3 ways to go out finding your key log and fixing that log jam in your life. You ready? Number 1, pray. Now, this might seem obvious, but it is often overlooked in our life, this idea of prayer when things are going crazy. Truthfully, it's fundamental. I mean, if you believe there's a God who created you, who knows you, who loves you, more than any other being in the world, this is a great place to start. And so let me just tell you about David. He was a man who had lots of log jams in his life. He was a man who had log jams in his relationships. He was a man who had log jams in his family. He was a man who had log jams in the organization that he led. And he prayed a prayer that would be an incredible starting point for you and me. And he wrote it down, and it's in our Bible in Psalm 139, verses 23 through 24. This is what he said: "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life." David said, "Lord, look, I don't want my life to be log jammed. I don't want my life to be stuck. I don't want my life to be destroyed by a key log. So God, would you search me? Would you let me know if there's anything in my life? What is the problem that's causing the problems?" I would just say starting here is foundational. Because God knows and sees and is aware of things in you that you may not even be aware of. And he can bring them to your awareness. He might do you the favor of helping your friend, your jam team, to begin to see things in your life that maybe they hadn't seen heretofore. And maybe God will use them to speak into your life. But I would just encourage you in this process to start with prayer. Say something like this to God. Just give him some time every day. Have this conversation with God every day. As you're driving down the road, or maybe when you get up in the morning, you have your cup of coffee and you grab your daily bread out there. There's a little book that helps you, that guides you kind of through some spiritual readings every morning. Give God some space in your life and have this conversation. God, is there a problem that's causing the problems in my life? What is it? Open up my eyes to this thing. It's a great place to start. The second place after beginning with prayer is this. It's a matter of probing. Remember what the jam team would do? They would jump in and they would run across all these logs and they would look for that log or those handful of logs that were creating this big backup. And they would use a tool in this process called a PV. Let me show you what a PV looks like. That doesn't look like any fun at all, does it? That looks like it could actually hurt, right? There's nothing pleasant about this tool, but it works. So this spring, in preparation for my 40th birthday, I spent a lot of time with a PV, a figurative PV, right? Wasn't jabbing or poking, carrying on like that. But I prayed, I read, I listened to mentors, and in my probing, I discovered that there was a key log in my life that had jammed me up for a long time, that had created a log jam. And I shared that with you a few months ago when I came back from that time of probing. And what it was is I realized that in the first 40 years of my life, I had moved 29 times. Like from location to location, moved 29 times in 40 years. And I'd never lived in one place longer than 6 years. In fact, right now, we have lived in Rock Hill longer than I have ever lived in any location of my life. And so at this point now, I'm learning how to do life like I've never lived in one spot longer than 6 years. So I knew how to live life in 6 year increments. And now we're in 7 years. I'm learning how. This is the first time I've ever done this. It's crazy. And by the way, like our intention is to have our girls marry Rock Hill boys, and I love this church. I love this church. I love you. I love being in this position. So, God willing, we die here. That chapter of our life is closed, and we just live the rest of our life in 6 year increments here, right? Well, my key log was this. For most of my life, people, places, things have been taken from me, and often without my consent. They've just been taken. Goodbye. I remember seeing life out of the back window of a station wagon. Remember when you could ride in station wagons and sit in the back seat facing drivers behind you? Remember that? All right, okay. So I, as a defense mechanism, had learned to withdraw from people and things before they were withdrawn from me. And what I realized is you can't do relationships well that way, can you? If you want to do relationships well with God, with friends, with family, with people, with a church, the best way to do that is to lean into them, not to withdraw from them. And so now I'm learning how to do relationships and friendships and life for longer than 6 years. But that is all the result of probing. And I discovered that only after extensive prayer and lots of probing. And so I would just encourage you in this process of identifying and unlodging that key log in your life to take the time to do the painful work, but the important work of probing, asking questions, listening to input from books that you read or friends that know you or family members that are willing to speak strongly into your life. Identify that log and break it loose. And the last step in this process would simply, it's not so much an attitude or an action as it is an attitude, and it's the attitude of patience. I alluded to this earlier, but breaking up a logjam is not a quick thing. But it's a work that must be done. And I love what St. Paul wrote to his friends in Philippians chapter 1. Look what he said. He said, I'm certain that God who began the good work within you will continue his work until it's finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns. Like God has started something inside of you. God has started something inside of me. God has started something inside of us. And he will complete it. It's going to take prayer. It's going to take probing. It's going to be listening to the input of friends and family and books and resources that will help us identify and break free those log jams. But if we'll be patient and we'll continue this process, God will complete this thing that he's working in your life. So I would simply say to you in the process of identifying this key log and thinking through this, like don't quit. Don't check out. So I read something the other day that I think was intended to be funny, but it's really sad if it ends up being true. Terry Pratchett wrote this. She said, inside every old person is a young person wondering what happened. And I read that and I'm like, God, I don't want that to be me. Like I don't want to be an old man, sitting on my lazy boy, looking back over the course of my life and thinking to myself, what was that? What was that? I want to be an old man who looks back over the course of my life and says, that was good. Loved it, would do it again. And the only way that happens is if we pay attention to the key logs in our life. If we live with an awareness and an eye for those problems that cause problems. If we live with an awareness of the key log. So what I want to do is this is an idea, I just want to give it to you as something that I'm processing. I'd love for you to process it with me. I just want to tell you though, as a church, that God is for you. God loves you. And he will walk with you through this process. He's begun something in you. And Paul said he'll finish that. Like he started something in you. He started changing your habits. He started changing the way you think about yourself and other people. He started changing the way that you do life, and he'll finish that. And our responsibility along the way is to be mindful of and be aware of key logs, the problem that causes problems. And keep breaking those out so the log drive can continue and ultimately end up at its desired destination where something beautiful is created and something beautiful is made. And so our band is going to come up. We're going to wrap up with this song. It says one thing. One thing remains. And here's one thing that remains. Like, God loves you. And the truth is, like, your life right now, all the logs may be flowing in the same direction and it's good, but sooner or later, you're going to hit a log jam. It happens. And in those moments, as you're identifying and seeking to find that key log, as you're praying, as you're probing, as you're patiently enduring this process, keep in mind this one thing. God is for you. Father, first of all, God, thank you for a couple things. Thank you, Lord, for just bringing ideas to our mind that would come oftentimes from unexpected sources. Somebody says something or somebody shares a thought or an idea, or we hear a story, and in that story is a nugget. Thank you, Lord, for just on a personal note, thanks for this idea of key log. Like I've just been processing this idea all week, God, about that it might not be that everything is wrong. It might be that something is wrong that's causing everything to back up. And God, I pray that all of us today, Lord, would begin to process this idea that maybe there's a key log. If we could break that free, the log jam would break up. God, thanks for your word that gives us insights and nuggets. And I pray, Father, that in this process of identifying the key log and breaking it up, that you would help us to be open, Lord, to the input of friends, that you would help us to be to be open to maybe some hard words that need to be spoken into our life. Because ultimately, iron sharpens iron. Help us to be open to that, Lord. Bring friends into our life that love us enough to speak hard truth into our life. I pray, God, that you would make us friends who are willing to speak that kind of truth into other friends' lives. Not because we're judging, not because we're critical, none of that, but because we love one another enough to help break out those log jams. Lord, in all the craziness, remind us always that one thing remains, one thing never changes, and that's your love for us. Thank you, Father, for hearing us today. We love you. I love this church, God. I love these men and women. Thanks for letting me be a part of this. Hear our psalm to you today in Jesus' name.